Hey guys, thank you so much for joining me on my very first reading of the book I wrote. It's been published about 5 years now. It's called Through My African Eyes. A lot of you have bought it, have read it, have loved it. Many of you still don't know about it. So I'm going to be reading a few chapters in the next few days, just to give you a sense of how I got to where I am today. It's been a long journey of discovery, not just of myself, but of my country and my continent. As I wrote in the inside sleeve, I hope the reader is able, through my eyes, to catch a glimpse of the Africa I had the fortune to access. I have been to 47 of the 54 African countries that make up this wonderful continent. And each time I have marveled at the power of the place and the spirit, so vibrant that no camera, no lens, no notepad can ever capture. Before I go on, there's a few people I'd like to thank, obviously, for making all this possible. First of all thanks to the Almighty, because without Him, nothing would be possible. I'd like to thank my mother, who encouraged me to read as a young man. Hated reading when I was young, as most people do. But she encouraged me, and I love to read. My history teacher, Mrs. Pereira, she taught me history like you'd never believe. I remember dates that mean nothing to most people, but they still stick in my mind. That's what made me love doing what I do. And then, believe it or not, it took me 5 years to write this book. 5 years. And then another 2 years to get it published, because a lot of publishers wouldn't publish it. So I thank, first of all, Thabo Mbeki, former South African president, for agreeing to write the preface. Imagine that. Great guy. One of the most amazing Africans. I might talk about him later on. And the foreword was written by none other than Professor Ngugi wa Thiong'o. I thank him too for that, for taking time to write his wonderful words. And then my publisher, Footprints Press, led by the amazing Susan Wahungu Githuku. We simply call her SG. I sent her the manuscript one time and she read it. You know, Footprints usually does coffee table books. And I asked Susan, I said, look, would you do a memoir? Would you do a biography? And she said, we've never done it. But I gave her the manuscript and she says, I'll read it and I'll get back to you. 2 days later, she got back to me and she said, Jeff, this reminds me of my growing up. Those were her words. It reminds me of my growing up in the 70s and 80s in Kenya. And she says, let's do it. And she agreed. And the rest, as they say, is history. Thank you so much. And you, every one of you who has bought this book, so much thanks to you folks. I really appreciate it. It's still available. Oh yeah, absolutely. If you can, if you want to, pick it up at the local bookstores. I recommend Prestige Bookshop in the CBD on Mamangina Street. Go see a guy called Ahmed. He'll hook you up. He'll even deliver this book to you. I tell you folks, there's nothing as fortunate as being able to tell your story. A lot of us will never get the chance to do the things that I did, see the places that I saw, meet the people that I met. But I did that and I had to put it into writing. And that's why I put this book together. So every other day, I'll be reading a chapter. And I want your responses. I want your questions, your comments, whatever you want to say. Please put it on. At Koinange Jeff is my handle. Send me whatever message you want, whatever you want to hear. Because there are 16 chapters in this book. It's only 258 pages. There's 16 chapters about my life so far. I want you to be a part of it. I want you to feel what I felt. Now, one of the most common questions that people ask me is, how did I become who I am? How did I become a journalist? Did I train? Did I always want to be a journalist? Look, to be honest, as a kid, I loved telling stories. I loved getting into a group and saying, hey guys, you wouldn't believe what happened last night. That kind of stuff. I loved doing that. But journalism was the furthest thing from my mind. Back in the day, you wanted to be a doctor, a lawyer, an accountant, an engineer. Those were the main jobs. Being a journalist was like an afterthought. Nobody, or very few people, wanted to train to be journalists. And with me, it was the same thing. I didn't know what I wanted to be. I had no idea. I wanted to be a sportsman. I know that for sure. But I never, ever imagined being a journalist. So, what I've decided, we're going to skip to chapter 4. That's right. And this will paint a picture of how my life changed at the age of 19, 20 years old. And I suddenly realized that I had a God-given gift. Let's get to it. Chapter 4 is called Flying High. If you have the book in front of you, just turn to chapter 4, page 78, and let's get to it. So, 4 months after leaving St. Mary's, where I went, I was desperate for a job. Many of my former colleagues were either in university or already working, and I felt I needed to do something to kill the boredom and the feeling of helplessness. I needed a job, any job, to support my mother and save to help get into college. That was my ultimate goal. So I got a temporary job at a place called Bankers Trust Overseas Representatives Incorporated. They called it Bitory at the time. I was an office clerk, messenger driver. I was all, doing odd jobs. But it was a job. In that job was a former St. Mary's colleague of mine. Her name was Linda Joshi. So we were working together. And one day, she comes into the office with a newspaper cutting. There's an airline. Well, not just any airline. Those days, it was the global airline. It was called Pan Am, Pan American Airways, Pan Am. And there was a listing, an advert, asking for flight attendants from Kenya. Imagine that. And she said, hey, man, why don't we apply? It was the last thing on my mind. I had no clue. I didn't even know what to say. I just said, okay, let's apply. So here we go. This is referring to 6 months into my job. Linda pops her head into my office as I'm filing some reports and asked if I knew that Pan Am, the famous US airline, was advertising for jobs for local flight attendants in the newspapers. Linda and I had discussed our future beyond Bankers Trust, and here was an opportunity of a lifetime. I knew for sure that my mother would not approve, but Linda and I applied anyway. So did more than 10,000 people, by the way. I actually did it just for fun. And after submitting my application, I forgot about it. 3 months later, in January 1986, I received a call from a lady called Giselle, who said she worked for the Pan Am station chief in Nairobi. She informed me that I had been shortlisted for an interview as a flight attendant. Having forgotten about the application, I was surprised, but quickly agreed to attend the interview. Linda, too, had received a call, and her interview was the day before mine. We were both excited for each other and nervous at the same time. Now, on the day of the interview, I arrived at the office early. That's Bankers Trust. Finished my chores and dashed out to the Nairobi Safari Club, Lillian Towers, many of you know where it is, where I found a long queue of applicants. We exchanged nervous pleasantries and waited as one by one we were called into an adjoining room. When it was my turn, I walked into the room to find an impeccably dressed middle-aged woman in a nice pinstripe suit and reading glasses who motioned for me to sit. We chatted for a while and she asked me why I wanted to be a flight attendant. I gave her the answers I thought would get me hired. Wanting to see the world and enjoying serving and working with people. She asked me whether I spoke any foreign languages other than English and Kiswahili. And I told her that I had taken some French lessons back at St. Mary's. 20 minutes later, the interview was over. And she told me I would receive a letter in the mail in the coming days. A few days later, I got that letter in the mail. I had been selected as one of 40. Remember, 10,000 people applied? I had been selected as one of 40 flight attendants to undergo training at Pan Am's Flight Academy in Miami, Florida. All expenses paid. I couldn't believe it. Suddenly, my world had opened up. I had been out of school for more than a year and was about to see the world in a way I never imagined. Excited, I dashed over to Linda, my colleague's office, and was to tell her the good news, only to find her in tears. She had received a letter of rejection. I did not know what to say. I felt guilty. Had there been a way for me to offer my place instead of her, I would have done so. However, Linda, ever so magnanimous, wished me nothing but the best. "This is the beginning of your life," she said. "Go get him, champ." Now, when I broke the news to my mother that evening, her disappointment and disapproval was scathing. I had deliberately not mentioned my interview. I explained that this would be my chance to go out of Kenya and see the world. Mother did not mince her words. "See the world," she said, "as a flight attendant? That's not seeing the world. You will be a glorified waiter in a dead-end job, and one day you'll wake up and you'll be 40 years old and still serving people on the aircraft," she lectured. "Is that what I raised you to be?" I was too excited to argue, and she probably had a point, but at the time it seemed like the opportunity of a lifetime, and I was not about to let it slip away. I resigned from my position the following day and began preparing for the trip. I would need to apply for a passport, an entry visa, and receive all the necessary immunizations. In the meantime, Pan Am had arranged for the finalists to meet at a cocktail event where the announcement would be made to the public. Now, it was a grand event, and I met the other 39 candidates. 3 of the 40 finalists happened to be former St. Mary's students. There was Ian Martin, who, by the way, was Linda, my former colleague's cousin. There was Chris Coutinho, a very well-known thespian back in Saints of Goan origin. And then there was myself. What are the chances? Now, we departed Kenya on February the 9th, 1986, flying business class for the very first time in our lives. There was a large crowd at the airport to see us off. Everyone had their own group of family and friends, but collectively, it looked like Nairobi, all of Nairobi, was at the airport. I remember waving to the crowds, some of whom I were former mates, walking up the steps of the Boeing 747 SP. was great. It was my first time ever on an international flight. I was assigned a window seat, 10A, right next to my former St. Mary's colleague, Ian Martin. We chatted excitedly as the flight attendants offered us champagne, juice, and a choice of magazines and newspapers. They demonstrated how to straighten and buckle the seat belts in preparation for takeoff. And as the plane took off into the beautiful African sunset, a sense of freedom engulfed me. For the very first time in my life, I was going to be on my own. I was about to see the world, meet new people, explore my talents, and hopefully fulfill my dreams. Now, once the aircraft reached its cruising altitude of 39,000 feet, we had a chance to get up, walk around, and chat amongst ourselves. The average age, I would find, was about 21 years old. I had just turned 20 the month before. Now, the oldest among us was Mike Gitau, tall, thin, very loud, but extremely personable character. Mike had worked in the service industry as well as various airlines for a number of years. He was a walking, talking encyclopedia when it came to advice. And the second oldest was Fred Arunga, the complete opposite of Mike. Slightly built, quiet, kept to himself, and only spoke when spoken to. Others in the group included Rwandese Richard Nyundo, a tall, handsome former model. His family had fled a conflict, civil war in Rwanda in 1979, and he had ended up in Kenya. He was a graduate of Utalii College, a prestigious hotel and tourism management school in Kenya, and a part-time model. There was Maggie Mbogo, a boisterous and buxom socialite who loved the sound of her own voice and loved a good time even more. There was Gloria Kakenyi, Maggie's best friend. We will find out later that no party ever took place without the two of them. Others included Marie Mushoki, Ruth Ngugi, and Jerry Gathungu. They would become known as the Three Musketeers, as they were never far apart from each other. There was Rose Stowe and Betsy Atkinson, both half Kenyan, half British. There were 5 Asians in the crew: Chris Coutinho, my former St. Mary's mate, Mehboob Sadiq, Mohammed Khan, Shaila Chowdhury, and Esmina Ramji. Unquestionably, the most beautiful duo in the entire crew were 2 Somali Kenyans, Dunai Abdi and Zahra Abdi, not sisters or cousins or related. They were often mistaken for the supermodel Iman. The two were gorgeous, but never flaunted it. They exuded a quiet confidence. Now, the others in the crew included the likes of Cecilia Yewa, Jimmy Tuti, Charlie Muthama, Peter Obara, Janet Kago, Rahab Mbogwa, simply known as Ray Ray. Now, we had a whole bunch of instructors with us, so this is what they told us as we were flying. Start paying attention to how the service is done. That'll be you pretty soon. We studied the service for a while, but I doubt any of us paid attention. 5 hours later, we landed in Lagos, Nigeria. Now, Nigeria at the time was ruled by a military government, and it was a tough place to do business by any standards. Luckily, Nigerians are always flying, mostly in business class. The West African leg turned out to be the most lucrative for Pan Am. In Lagos, we were not allowed to get off the plane. We stayed there for about an hour and a half as the new passengers came on board, and we took off again, heading towards Robertsfield International Airport, about 45 minutes away, outside the capital of Liberia. Now, Liberia was a former colony of freed African slaves and was considered the continent's oldest republic. Robertsfield was named after one of the country's early presidents, Joseph Jenkins Roberts. Incidentally, Robertsfield has one of the longest runways in Africa, more than 3.5 miles long. We would later find out that it was constructed specifically for the National Aeronautical Space Agency, NASA. The runway was supposed to be an alternative airfield created in case the space shuttle ever deviated from its normal course and had to force land in Africa. The country's president then, Master Sergeant Samuel Doe, was a military man who had overthrown the previous government. Now, our chaperones informed us that Robertsfield would be our layover station once we began our flights. We would deplane as the American crews continued on to New York 3 days later. And then the aircraft would come back and a fresh batch of passengers, and we would take over from Monrovia through Lagos back to Nairobi. Now, Robertsfield, let's get back to Robertsfield, felt like a really nice place to be when we landed. The place seemed peaceful, the people pleasant and friendly. It did take a while to get used to the Liberian accent, a heavy mixture of American South meets West Africa. We called it patois. Little did I know that 15 years later, I would be returning regularly to this place, reporting from what would become one of Africa's most volatile nations. For now, it was a destination of peace and tranquility, rare in West Africa at the time, and our future home away from home. Our layover hotel was a 5-minute walk, literally walking across the airport to the hotel. Appropriately, it was called Robertsfield International Hotel. Now, after 7 hours in the air, we were exhausted. I do not remember landing in Dakar, the Senegalese capital. I was woken up for breakfast an hour before landing at John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York. I pushed up the window shade to see an endless stretch of skyscrapers in the distance. Wow, I thought. So this is New York. It seemed like I was still dreaming. And if that was the case, I certainly did not want to wake up. We landed shortly after, touching down on an icy cold runway on an American soil for the very first time in my life. We were ushered past immigration and into the lounge where we would stay for 5 hours before taking our onward journey to Miami, Florida. This was the first time any of us had seen snow, and we strained our necks to watch the maintenance crews and baggage handlers working in the snow. Finally, our flight was called, and 3 hours later, we landed at sunny Miami International Airport. We were warmly welcomed by the instructors and ushered into courtesy buses for the trip to the hotel. Everything around us was so clean, so neat, so well organized. From the roads to the buildings to the traffic. 24 hours after leaving Nairobi, we finally got to our hotel, the Trust House 40 in South Beach, where we were assigned a room and a roommate. Classes will begin the following day. We were divided into 2 groups of 20. The first class would run from 7 a.m. to 3 p.m. and the second from 4 p.m. to midnight. I was assigned to group number 2, and coincidentally, so was my roommate, Ian Martin. We then received the first of our weekly stipend of $410. It was more money than I had ever seen in my life. We literally felt like we had died and gone to heaven. After checking into our rooms, us boys took a walk to check out our new surroundings. We ended up at the beachfront and found ourselves gawking with no restraint. What we saw on the beach was unreal. Lolling on the beach was a mosaic of beautiful people, just having what seemed to be the time of their lives. Some were driving amazing Jeeps, others lounged about, while most skimpily dressed in bikinis and shorts. Fred, one of our crew, gathered the courage to ask what was going on. A woman turned back and, somewhat surprised, said, "Well, it's spring break, don't you know? Welcome to Miami." None of us knew what spring break meant at the time, but whatever it was, we had never imagined anything like it. The picture of spring break, Miami, 1986, will forever be etched in my memory. I remember saying to myself, this is where I want to be. I love this country. Despite the jet lag, we stayed up for a while watching the scenes unfolding before us as though we were in a zoo on the set of a Hollywood movie. Now, the next day, reality set in as classes began at 7 a.m. for the first group. We arrived at the Pan American Academy promptly at 4 p.m. and were ushered into the classroom. For the next 8 hours, instructor after instructor came in and taught us the ins and outs of the various aircrafts we would be flying, from the Boeing 727 to the massive 747, which would carry more than 400 passengers. It was all pretty basic, but intense. We were tested every day and the scores tallied for an overall grade. We were told that only 30 of us out of 40 would make the cut at the end of the 8 weeks. 10 candidates would have to be let go. Competition was therefore very intense, but still very friendly. I sensed by the end of the week, the instructors already knew who would not make the cut. It was much like the first week at boot camp. The drill sergeant knows early who will and who will not make it. In the third week, the classes became more demanding. We were taught how to handle emergencies. Classes consisted of emergency scenarios, and we were drilled on how to deploy the emergency rafts as well as gauging possible trouble situations. This was undoubtedly the most challenging part of the course because failure in the daily tests meant immediate expulsion and a ticket back to Nairobi. This happened to several of our colleagues who failed the instructions required during a ditching. This is when the aircraft ends up in the water. Simulation took place in a swimming pool and we had to improvise being in an ocean. It was sad seeing our colleagues go, but we were reminded that this was not a holiday, and failure to follow procedure would mean the difference between life and death for passengers. We also had to undergo a physical examination every 2 weeks, including blood tests. Another colleague was declared unfit after a second test, and he was immediately sent home. Someone later said that traces of illegal substances had been found in his blood. Now, on the few occasions that we had the day off in Miami, Ian, my roommate, and I would arrange for both sets of classes to get together to come to our room for a party. Most would accept our invitations, eager to take some time off from the hectic routine. We would buy beer and sodas, which were pretty affordable with our monthly stipends. And then we would fill our bathtub with ice and drinks. I remember Fred, in particular, loved his music and would be the designated disc jockey. And Mike, Richard, the Three Musketeers, Maggie, Gloria, Betsy, Rose would always be there. Once in a while, the bravest among us would venture out to the clubs in Miami area just to experience what it was like. Miami was both exciting and an eye-opener beyond our wildest expectations. Miami, it seemed, never went to sleep, and we adapted fast. Lucky for us, our classes did not begin until the afternoon, so we could sleep off most hangovers from the night before. Now, there was a funny incident that happened about 2 weeks into our training. A group of us walked into McDonald's. Many of you know the famous franchise McDonald's, famous throughout the world for its burgers and tasty fries. But this was new to us at the time. We knew it was a place to eat because there was one everywhere we looked. Fast food was a foreign concept to us Africans, but in America, it seemed to be what everyone ate. On every street, typically, there'll be a McDonald's, a Pizza Hut, a Wendy's, or the like, all in a row. It was a junk food enthusiast's dream. However, to us, it seemed quite strange. Now, many of you know that when you go to McDonald's, you pick a tray, order your food, then proceed to the table to have your meal. Once done, you pick up your tray with the wrappings, toss the contents into the trash, and lay the tray table on top of that table. Well, it just so happens that one of our colleagues, Charlie, decided to throw everything into the trash bin, including the tray. He was not alone. The rest of us followed suit, thinking it was the right thing to do. 6 trays disappeared into the trash that day. The McDonald's staff must have thought we were from another planet. But in retrospect, I get a good laugh thinking how we were trying to fall in line, imitating the locals, and yet we did not fit quite right. Now, the weeks at Pan Am Flight Academy flew by, and we quickly adjusted to the routine of late afternoon classes and even later nights. It was great waking up to the late breakfast at McDonald's, occasionally visiting a nearby flea market for some shopping, a bit of siesta, and then getting ready for afternoon classes. At midnight, we would walk back, pick up a 6-pack on the way to the hotel, and revise a little before the usual drinking session. Despite the laid-back routine, classes were great. We were all business because we understood what was at stake. It was a chance to land a job that would see us travel the world, something many young people from the developing world could never dream of. I managed to maintain a 95% average, always had top marks, and was a favorite among the instructors. By week 6, we were expected to simulate real-life scenarios. As part of the simulation, a real aircraft was parked on the tarmac at the academy. The morning group simulated actual working flights, while we, the evening group, simulated passengers. Even as passengers, we were told to observe and take notes from our colleagues. It was time to practice what we had learned in the classroom. We were working under the supervision of actual seasoned Pan Am flight attendants who took time off from their work. All were based out of New York, and all had pretty much experience in flying and working. There were certain duties on the aircraft that some people are drawn to. Some like working the back of the aircraft where the passenger load is heavy. Others prefer the upper deck, especially on a 747 where the business class are demanding and the workload is less hectic. And then there are those who prefer first class, where the passengers are picky, the service has to be perfect, because at the end of the day, these are the passengers who pay our salaries, and for the most part, they make it known to us. I actually did not mind working anywhere in the aircraft. Variety was fun, and more challenging the duties, the quicker the flight time seemed. However, the instructors had other plans for me. They recognized that I had a good voice and always insisted I serve first class so that I could make the in-house announcements. The service was easy, and doing the welcome and safety announcements was fun. Actually, here's how it began. One day, the instructors literally told me, "Hey, Jeff, go up to that microphone up there and go to the instruction books and read the welcome announcements." I said, "No problem." Walked up to the first class, grabbed the microphone, and I said, "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome aboard Pan American Clipper Flight 089 from Nairobi, Kenya, onwards to Lagos, Nigeria, with continuing services to Monrovia, Dakar, and New York. All of us are trained in cabin safety, and we ask that you watch and listen carefully as we review the safety features of this Pan American Boeing 747. That's what I said on the mic, and I stopped, and I looked around, and one of the instructors looked at me and said, "Do that again." I said, "Do what again?" He said, "Do exactly what you did again." I said, "Oh, okay." I thought I had done something wrong, so I got on the mic. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome aboard Pan American Clipper Flight 089 from Nairobi, Kenya, with continuing services to Lagos, Monrovia, Dakar, and New..." He said, "You're the guy." And I said, "I'm what guy?" He said, "You're that guy." And right away, I knew what he meant. The guy who would make those announcements. To cut a long story short, once we graduated from the Pan American Flight Academy in Miami, came back to Nairobi and started working the flights, I'll do the same thing. We started working as real flight attendants. I was like, "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome aboard Pan American Club Flights." It was, it was an act. It was fun. It was fantastic. I would tell you, 7 times out of 10, passengers would be like, "Oh my goodness. Oh, is that a radio announcement? Is that a recorded announcement?" And my colleagues would tell them, "No, it's that guy over there in the front. It's him." And they would say, "Call him. We want to talk. Call him." 7 times out of 10. Passengers, and we're talking 747 with more than 400 passengers on board, 7 times out of 10 I'd have people asking for me to go and talk to them. And of course, after the service, I would go back and they'd say, "Hey, listen, kid," I was 20 years old, 20 years at the time. They'd say, "Hey, kid, you're wasting your time. That voice, that gift you have in the middle of your throat, that is your gift." And I would laugh every time. I'd say, "Come on, man. I mean, this is just fun. I love doing what I do." But every other time, I'd get a stranger, passenger, someone I didn't know, telling me, "Hey, kid, go out and make something with that voice." And after a while, it kept hammering into my mind. Despite the fun we had of flying, I loved being a flight attendant. I loved serving passengers. I loved flying and seeing the world. By the way, that same December, 1986, the Nigerian government stopped paying Pan Am in US dollars. They said they didn't have any more US dollars to pay the flight coming in and going out, and Pan Am had to discontinue that flight. So we stopped flying from Nairobi to West Africa to New York. And instead, a new base was created in Frankfurt, Germany, which is where they redirected all of us. But Frankfurt meant a new aircraft, so we had to go for extra training in Berlin. Can you imagine? Those days, 1986, Berlin was still part of Eastern Europe. There was still a point where East Berlin was separated from West Berlin. And we were flying into this place for further training because the Airbus Academy was in Berlin, where we trained for the A310, the A320, the A300, all that was in Berlin. So we stopped the entire operation in West Africa and started now flying from Nairobi to Frankfurt, although we did that training in Berlin. And while we were in Berlin, we got a chance to see that dividing wall. Imagine that. They called it Checkpoint Charlie or Checkpoint C. I divided East Berlin from West Berlin. Of course, 2-3 years later, that wall came crashing down. But that's a story for another day. But it was incredible. It was incredible working for the airline. I loved it. After a year and a half, I decided, you know what? Maybe it's time for me to pursue my gift, the gift that God gave me. It's time to leave this airline, as great as it was, and fly to America and pursue my dream. By the way, while flying to Frankfurt, most of us would stay an entire week because there was one flight a week to Nairobi, from Frankfurt to Nairobi. But in between, if you wanted to, you could fly to other destinations and work those destinations. London, Paris, Milan, Dubrovnik in what was then Yugoslavia. We could fly to New Delhi back then, Bombay, which later became Mumbai, Karachi in Pakistan. We got a chance to see Tel Aviv in Israel. We got a chance to see the entire world just based in Frankfurt. And then at the end of the week, we would get onto the Nairobi flight, fly to Nairobi, and be off for a week or so. I did that for a while until the middle of 1987. Actually, the exact date is the 7th of July, 1987. I quit from Pan Am, completely quit. And I said, I'm going to pursue my dream. It was a shock to most of my colleagues who thought, you know what, this is a great life. Why you want to do this? But I knew I had something more. There was something in the back of my mind telling me, there's a dream out there for you. There's something out there. You have to go and see it. And sometimes maybe some of you find yourself in that position. You feel there's something more you want to do, something more you want to achieve. Sometimes you fight it, or the demons inside you fight you. But at the end of the day, it's up to you. It's up to you. So I quit and I left Nairobi for New York in 1987, and I began my new life. But I got to tell you a couple of incidents that happened while we were flying, because it's incredible. It's like a prelude to later on. And I mentioned earlier on, Liberia was definitely one of my most favorite destinations. I don't know why. The country, Africa's oldest republic, incredible, amazing people, amazing country. And there's some calm to it. By the way, did you know that Kenyans in the 70s would fly to Liberia on holiday? That's how peaceful and calm that country was. Later on, of course, it was in a crazy civil war, but I'll tell you about that later on. So during one incident, it happened on the flight from Lagos to Nairobi to Monrovia. We were waiting on board for the incoming passengers. Suddenly, there was a rush at the forward door. Several military men entered the aircraft, went straight to seat 1A, in first class, of course, and stood there. A short while later, several more military men entered and escorted an impeccably dressed man to the seat. We learned that the VIP, obviously was a VIP, was Liberia's Minister for Finance. I was working in the front of the aircraft and went over to introduce myself. He was warm and pleasant and told us simply to call him Emmanuel. But I insisted on calling him Your Excellency. He turned out to be a great passenger, and we had a wonderful flight. We landed in Monrovia, where more bodyguards in military fatigues boarded the flight and escorted the minister out with the usual theatrics. Now, we cleared the aircraft and got ready for the usual exchange and headed to our hotel across the road. 30 minutes later, the phone in my room rang. There was a gentleman in military fatigues to see me. Somewhat concerned, I rushed downstairs to the reception. After a brief exchange, the official told me that he was sent by the Honorable Minister of Finance to accompany the entire crew as guests to his hotel on the other side of town. It was now, by the way, 11 p.m. in Monrovia, and I told him we were grateful, but it would be too late, and maybe we could take the minister up on the offer another time. The military man was not taking no for an answer, and he explained that all the arrangements had been made and there were vehicles outside ready to escort us. He seemed like he was in no mood for an argument. I asked him to give me a few minutes to round up the crew. Well, 20 minutes later, about 6 crew members turned up, ready for the adventure ahead. Now, Monrovia was a good 45 minutes away, and we drove in a convoy through the dark, somber highway. There were checkpoints all along the way, but each time the driver would stick out his head and say, "Guests of the Minister of Finance." And each time we were let through with a stiff salute. An hour later, we were in the capital, and surprisingly, the streets were lit up and everything seemed to come to life. We drove on for another 15 minutes until we came to a residential neighborhood. There was one final checkpoint, and we were driven into a huge complex that seemed more like a hotel. In fact, it was a hotel. A sign on it said, Hotel Africa. We had heard about this hotel. It was one of the finest in West Africa, complete with an underground nightclub, a casino, live entertainment 7 days a week. It appeared that we were expected, and we were ushered in and taken straight to the underground nightclub. The place was teeming with partygoers, dancing and gyrating to the African beat as we were led to the VIP section. As we entered, there he was, Emmanuel Shaw III, the Minister of Finance, sipping champagne and smoking a giant Cuban cigar. He rose to greet us, and before we could thank him for his gesture, he simply said, "Thanks for the wonderful service. I can honestly say that was one of the best flights I have ever flown. Come, let's have a drink." Now, you can imagine the shock on our faces. And having said that, it was a night we will never forget. The champagne was flowing, and the whiskey and the wine came in plenty all night long. It was in the wee hours of the morning when the DJ announced the last song. We were still in the VIP booth, and the minister turned to us and said, "I've arranged rooms for all of you. You will be my guests for the weekend." We could not believe it. All this for doing what we were paid to do? What was the catch? It turned out there was no catch. It was just one man's appreciation for our services and professionalism. Needless to say, we checked into our rooms just as the sun was coming up and ended up sleeping most of the day. Late in the afternoon, I woke up and decided to do some sightseeing. I made my way past the lobby into the pool area. That is when it hit me. The reason the hotel was called Hotel Africa was because the swimming pool was built in the shape of the map of Africa, complete with a bar right in the middle, right about Congo there. Beyond the hotel were dozens of chalets right on the beach. Apparently, Hotel Africa had been built in the late 1970s when then President William Talbot was elected chairman of the Organization of African Unity, OAU. He had decided to build 50 chalets representing what were then 50 African states. We ended up spending the entire weekend at Hotel Africa, and when we finally returned to Roberts Field International Airport and Roberts Field Hotel, we found a bit of a crisis in progress. Apparently, no one knew where half the crew had disappeared and gone to, and the ground personnel were frantically calling everywhere from Nairobi to New York to find out what had happened. We got a real telling off from our supervisors, who were in a panic. It was a lesson about always letting someone know whenever one decides to leave the base of operations. So a year and a half after being a flight attendant for Pan Am, decided to call it quits because I had found something deep down inside my throat that I knew was my gift. So the next part was going to work on that gift, to churn that gift, to make that gift come to life. That's when I decided that broadcast journalism was going to be my life. Being a journalist, telling the African story, that was going to be my life. Imagine at the age of 20, 21. Most people decide when they're 10, 12 years old, 15 years old. The age of 21, I decided this was it. So next time, right here, I'm going to tell you about some of the stories I encountered. And the reason why I mentioned Liberia so much It was one of my favorite countries. Peaceful for more than 150 years, suddenly thrown into turmoil and civil conflict. There's some amazing characters in Liberia that I met as a reporter. I'm going to tell you about that. Tell you about Sierra Leone, the other side of hell, for lack of a better word, where I met child soldiers as young as 8 years old. I'm going to tell you about Congo, Africa's third largest country, as large as all of Eastern Europe. I'll tell you about that. Stay tuned. If you have any comments, please put them in there. Let's interact. Let's talk. That's what it's all about, folks. And if you get a chance, pick up Through My African Eyes. Available at your local bookshop. Prestige Bookshop in the CBD is where I recommend. I tell you, folks, if you want a journey of discovery like I have been through, pick up the book or join me in the next session of A Chapter a Day Through My African Eyes. See you then.